Good evening, and welcome back to Dominion Energy Jazz Cafe from the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. You'll notice it's much different than you're used to. I notice too. I miss you. I miss that I can't see your face and hear your voices. I miss that I can't dance with you. I miss that I can't have a glass of wine with you. I miss seeing so many beautiful people packed into the best cafe here at Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, or in the atrium, or in the Marble Hall, or in the galleries or the gardens. I miss you all, and I love you dearly. But I couldn't be gone for too long. I still have things to say, and you still have things to hear. I've decided to look at this series in a little bit of a different way than we're accustomed. A live concert event is something that won't be happening here for a little bit of time, but that doesn't mean we can't still love one another. Tonight, we launch the first of 6 discussions on jazz, on its impact throughout culture, on its impact in times of civil rights struggles, and just in the history of the world. We're going to look at music, we're going to look at events, we're going to look at artists. Tonight, we begin with a discussion on one of the very most famous pieces of jazz music. I wish I could say it's the most famous, but it certainly is one, from one of the most well-known singers, certainly, Strange Fruit, and Billie Holiday. It's 1930 when Abel Meeropol discovers a photograph of 2 black men hanging from a tree in Indiana, surrounded by a sea of white faces. Thomas Shift and Abram Smith were lynched that day. Abel, haunted by this photograph, could not get the image out of his mind. He simply could not forget what he'd seen. He was a tender man, a soft heart, a kind man, a white man, a man from a family of Russian Jewish immigrants in Bronx, New York. He was a poet, an English teacher, an activist, attending a very interesting high school I wish I could get into, but many, many great people come from that school. I think most relevant in today's popular culture is Stan Lee, studied in the same school, where this man studied himself and taught. Well, in 1930, after being haunted for days by this image, by this photograph of these 2 men who he did not know, lynched, not in the South, but in Indiana, he took his hands and they grabbed a pen and put pen to paper, and he wrote a poem he called Strange Fruit. That was brave in 1930. Braver still to take that poem and to publish it in a journal for teachers. Not done with telling the story, this poet, also amateur composer, set the words to music. He took that music to a local nightclub. The owner took the music and gave it to a young Billie Holiday. We'll get more to Billie in a moment. I want to talk a little bit more about Abel, who, as I mentioned, was a very tender man. We know later on in his life, he became known as the poet Lewis Allen, a name he chose giving homage to his 2 stillborn sons. Even so, he and his wife went on to raise 2 boys, not their own, but 2 boys they adopted. Robert, my namesake, tells a story of how he was responsible for cutting the grass. And one day, while cutting the grass, he approached a tree surrounded by saplings, and he was just going to run over them. He didn't know what they were. And here comes Abel running out. No, you mustn't harm them. You mustn't kill them. So sensitive and tender a man was he that not even the death of a sapling tree could pass in his mind. And so he collected those plants, put them in pots, and surrounded his house with them. The gentleness of this man's heart should not be mistaken, as it should with no gentle person's heart be mistaken for weakness or cowardice. This brave man still went on to publish this scathing review of culture for his time. Well, Billie Holiday is presented with this song, doesn't know what to do with it. But in 1939, at 23 years old, she walks on stage in a nightclub. She performs her set, and she has one thing left to say. At her request, service is paused. There's no chatter. The room falls still. At her request, all lights go dim save one spotlight aimed at her young face. The music behind her begins. Her mouth opens, and the world is introduced for the first time to Billie Holiday and Strange Fruit. The final cadence is played. Every light now is black, including the spot on her face, for moments. The lights raise, and a bare, empty stage is revealed. Billie had left the building. She went on to perform Strange Fruit for 20 years until her death in at 44 years old. She didn't like it, really. It's not that she didn't like the song. She didn't really enjoy performing it for the same reason why she felt she had to perform it. It reminded her of the death of her father, whom she called Pop. She remembered him contracting a lung ailment, and he needed to be seen by a doctor, but because his skin was shades too dark, he was not given treatment, and he died. And Billie marveled at how 20 years after her father's death, a black man in America, a black woman in America, could still be sentenced to death for being sick. And so she felt she had to say something, and Strange Fruit gave her that opportunity. It pained her to remember her father each time she sang it, but she sang it indeed, nevertheless. The message of Strange Fruit echoes through history. Nina Simone picks it up decades later. She's not the only, she's not the first. Many other people have tackled this very important song, and it brings us to our discussion today. Now, while I'm happy to be in front of you, I'm happy to share some of who I am with you, I can't do it alone. 2017, another great event in the history of the world, in my opinion, and yours too, I'm sure. VMFA got to become acquainted with, I don't know a ton of curators, but I know more than some of you probably do, and we're about to have a conversation with the very best of them in my mind. Valerie, would you please join us?
Of course.
Valerie Cassel Oliver. Now, as she's coming on, I was thinking earlier about my experience. And it's a little bit eerie that we're here in this room. There are 3 others in the room with us. I've just invited my guest on to set, and no applause feels so strange to a stage performer like myself.
That's okay. I just dropped the mic, so it would have been a little awkward anyway.
That's all right. This is our first go-round.
But I'm revealing myself. I hope everyone is taking care and wearing a mask. I'm so delighted to be here with you. I am enthralled with what you are doing with this series, and still discussing music, still celebrating the genre.
Yes, ma'am.
But doing so in a way that expands it just beyond the sound itself and into more of the depths behind songs.
And that's what I hope we get to with these series, these conversations with curators and musicians and activists alike. Valerie, before we begin our discussion, would you tell the audience a little bit more about you? And as you do so, I'll craft us a little cocktail.
Thank
Have
you.
a little sip.
Fantastic. If I can keep my microphone on my person. Well, I will say that I did join the museum in, let's see if that works, in 2017. So I've been here, actually this will be a celebratory drink. My first day was July 7th, 2017. So in a way we are celebrating. I came here from Texas, from Houston, which is where I was born and raised. Working then at the Contemporary Arts Museum in Houston for about 17 years. And a little bit about that museum is it is a non-collecting museum. So whereas I was able to do a lot of great work, it is really astounding to be at this institution and be able to shape the sort of history by actually acquiring works of art. And so it's really lovely to not only have those conversations, but to also have them last and have them stay as part of the expanded understanding of history and landscape and moment. They become a part of history. We're writing history as it happens, and we know that we are living in a historical moment in time, which is quite remarkable.
Absolutely agreed. Very well. Very well put.
And how interesting that you would choose this particular song, because that was a protest song of its day. And we are, of course, in the midst of great upheaval in this country, and there are protests out in the street. There are still discussions around lynchings in this country, which is thank you so much. That looks delicious, by the way. And I'm excited to quench a thirst here. But that, in many ways, it's not so much circular as it is, I like to think of as spiral, that as we come back to this point that we may be a little more in a position to find reconciliation and closure. I'm hoping that that is what is transpiring.
You know, I think about the same things. I'm remembering 2 weeks ago waking up to the headlines of an attempted lynching here in, not in Virginia, but in 2020, 90 years after the birth of Strange Fruit.
Yes, and also actual recordings of individuals being lynched in Texas and in California, which are still being investigated. I think one was ruled suicide, but they are still investigating that. But the fact that bodies would be hanging from trees, period, is a very tragic and terrifying thought. And it reminds me also of an exhibition, and the power of art, I think, is what I was also thinking for Abel Meeropol to use art, poetry.
Absolutely.
For Billie Holiday to use song and voice to give face, to give an empathetic rally to the horrors that were taking place in this country.
Now, I talked earlier about the bravery of Abel in penning the song, but Billie Holiday too.
Absolutely.
You know, a black woman in America, a well-known jazz singer, for sure, not immune to the trauma of racism, choosing at 23 years old to a sea of white faces to sing about her own oppression at the hands of people who looked like them. That's courage that I don't know I find in myself.
And arguably her death.
Oh, absolutely.
Her death, which was seen as retribution for her resistance to silence herself. There were many times that she was approached to stop singing Strange Fruit, and she continued to do so, and at 44, on her deathbed, was chained to a bed and as an act of retribution, not allowed to be treated because of her courage to continue to sing that song.
You know, Abel Meeropol, I think it's important to tell the things I know about the story to be as truthful as I can. 1930s, I mentioned he's in the family of Russian Jewish immigrants. A communist as well, Mr. Meeropol was. And in the 40s, the 1940s, his song, of course, Ruffling Some Feathers, was called into a room, in front of a group of men who were investigating American communism. The entire sole purpose of him being pulled into that room was to be questioned about the communists having paid him to write the song. It must be the only reason one would write something like that. Of course, that wasn't the case. But his bravery stood, even then.
Well, and it really speaks to the bravery of youth. And as you said, Billie Holiday was only 23. And we see even today the young men and women who are on the front line, and the diversity that is there is truly astounding, but all coming together, but the youth. And so when we think about, really the people who put their bodies on the line oftentimes, not that other subsequent generations, older generations aren't present, they are, but it's often the youth, whether it was during the civil rights movement or in that case during that time. And we have to realize that, this is the aftermath. I mean, the 1930s is probably the apex when you find lynchings. There were roughly, I think, 4,500 maybe close to 4,800, someone will check this, I'm sure, 4,800 lynchings, of which 3,500 were of African American men and women. So these were mostly happening in the South. We have to realize that this is the aftermath of slavery. African Americans having been enslaved and in bondage. This is the aftermath of Reconstruction, where you see huge progress happening, and yet when the Freedmen's Bureau pull out and the Federal Protective Services pull out, this oppression which comes back to suppress. And oftentimes why people were lynched, often the myth was that it was because the sanctity of white women were being threatened or there was a rape. But Ida B. Wells debunked that. And in the many cases that were investigated, it was often a sort of economic questions or strife around economics. Someone demanding to be paid at the level, or a business succeeding where someone else has failed.
There's something striking to think that Strange Fruit is about lynching, yes. Not once in the text do we say the word lynch or lynching or any iteration of this word. We're simply describing an event, but we all know what that event is. And even today, we're still having to talk about whether or not this act should be a federal felony.
Well, it was, in fact, deemed, the anti-lynching bill not only passed once, but passed twice. And
Amen.
yet, where the protective, where the actual protections, and as you said, it's called into question yet again. When we see time after time, men and women dying at the hand of law enforcement, unfortunately, the people who have taken oaths to serve and protect. And so while we support our law enforcement, there really has to be a reconciliation as to why these issues are taking place, as to why people are being murdered with impunity, and where that accountability lies. And so it's not just a matter of a few bad apples, it is about a structural armature that enables it to happen, that the policing is, enforced heavily as an act of deterrent and suppression, primarily in Black neighborhoods.
Absolutely.
Whereas they are seen as different in different neighborhoods. So, the likelihood of that engagement are much higher among African Americans. And I think we have to look honestly. This is an opportunity. The upheaval, the uprising, the coronavirus, COVID-19, has really enabled what I think of as a global reset. And the stark thing about it is this isn't just an innately American thing.
Preach.
It is happening all over the world. And indigenous populations, no matter where they are in the world, people who have come to certain cities and countries having undergone colonialism in their own lands are dealing with these same issues, whether they're in France or Great Britain or, we can't even we can go on and on, Brazil.
All over the world.
All over the world, people are taking to the streets to say, enough.
And those were some powerful images. I sitting in my couch in my living room, those were some very powerful images. I want to ask you some about the artistic impact that these thoughts, these ideas, this song itself has had on the visual world, how we see it represented in contemporary times. But first, thank you very much to Molly from Amuse for helping us to prepare our cocktail. Let's give it a little sip. Cheers to you.
Cheers to you, dear.
3 years.
What a gorgeous color.
So
I'm going to shift this just so that I can drink it.
There you go. This is our lavender Tom Collins, our summer drink to
that's
go with our flowers.
delicious. It's very light and refreshing. And I can taste a bit of the gin in that.
Yeah.
It's very
definitely a
delicious.
gin cocktail.
Yeah, it's delicious.
So Valerie,
Yes.
we've talked about Strange Fruit, we've talked about how it's impacted you. Can you talk to me a little bit about how some of your favorite artists have grappled with this subject?
Wow, well, there has always been a call and response, if you will, between visual artists and musicians. And we can really expand that to any number of artistic disciplines, whether that's dance or literature, what have you. But it's something I'm very interested in exploring, and that will come out in the exhibition The Dirty South come in May.
I didn't know if we could say that, man.
Yes.
Yes.
It's sort of triangulation between music, what I would determine as folk art, and we'll call for this subject matter material culture, and then artists who are academically trained. So that triangulation has existed for centuries, oftentimes. And so when you really think about how visual artists are responding to the moment, to the times, to the day, I mean, certainly you had around the time of the 1919, what we have as the Harlem Renaissance.
Yep.
That Renaissance didn't just happen to Harlem. It wasn't limited to Harlem. You had Bronzeville and Chicago. You had many urban centers that there was an absolute explosion of artistic vitality taking place there. You had people like Hale Woodruff. You had people like, Romare Bearden. You had artists like Jacob Lawrence, who were really grappling with these issues and grappling with the subject matter itself. And then when you think about the scope of lynching, that a lot of that, the number that I cited earlier, was really between 1880 and 1968. That is the advent of, the Black Power movement, the period of self-determination. So you can imagine throughout all of that long trajectory, from the late 1800s to 1968, there is a tremendous amount of artists doing incredible work that speak to the atrocities being placed on Black bodies. Contemporarily, which is where I live in contemporary art, there have been many artists to go back and revisit that. There is an artist, Ken Gonzalez Day, who really takes those old lynching photographs and blows them up and extracts from them the Black body. So what oftentimes people see, and they see them in very large kind of monumental scale, is, as you describe, the sea of people who are gazing, and it really allows you to focus away from the tortured body and in what you're seeing and what they're seeing and how they're seeing it, the expressions that are on their faces. And oftentimes you're suddenly realizing there are children there are women there are old people, there are young people. It is astounding. It is a communal event that takes place.
Smiles on their faces.
Indeed,
Smiles.
Indeed.
This was an event to be celebrated and to be attended.
Yes.
Ghastly as it seems to us today.
Yeah.
The impact of the image is something that I'd like you to speak a little bit more about. As a performer myself, we talk about having something to say, right? And if you can't say something, you sing it, and if you can't sing something, you dance it, with the very visual part of the performance. Because without the words to distract you, you've really got to pay attention to this message it's coming across. How does the visual artist tackle that responsibility?
With great expertise. I mean, I think in any kind of expression, the secondary, if not primary aspect is how it really plays in the eyes of the viewer, how it is absorbed, and what it does in that moment of absorption, that it moves you. Now, sometimes it's very provocative, it's a gut punch. Sometimes it sneaks up on you. It's like a, oh, and then it's like a, ah. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So it really is, that provocation is always there for the artist.
And what impact, what impact to that end does the subject have, and what impact does the intended audience have on the artist's creation of a work, especially one telling such a raw and pointed story like the story of a lynching or the story of strange fruit?
Well, I mean, I think you see that, but you see that in the expression, the unique expression that the artist has decided to, how they've decided, the kind of dialect, the kind of visual language that they engage. If you look at someone like a Sam Gilliam, you know, he has a series of paintings called April 4th. And for those of you know, that was the day that Martin Luther King was assassinated. Now, it's not figurative. There are no figures. You don't see Martin Luther King lying on that balcony. You don't see him, you know, or Jesse Jackson or Abernathy pointing in the aftermath of this assassination. What you see are these monumental, beveled, framed canvases that have stains of red and burgundy, and in some cases very mixtures of lavender and pink inside of them. But what does it evoke? It evokes a blood-stained shirt.
Yeah, a lot of emotion, it evokes a feeling of trauma for me. You know, I've never been lynched. I'm sitting here having the opportunity to talk about this subject with someone I greatly admire and respect. Thank you so much for being here. I'm thinking now about Abel's use of the term, the pastoral scene. You know, it's a very descriptive and a very visual element to the song. He talks about poplar trees and magnolias, the scent of them. Images, these strong images of the South and of trees. How often do we see things like that popping up in art as it's created? And how often, if ever, are those images meant to tell a part of this story?
Well, there's an amazing work by Christian Marclay called Guitar Drag, and it was done in response to the killing of James Byrd, who was lynched in Texas, Orange, Texas, by being drugged behind a pickup truck. And so it is a film, it's a video, actually, and what you see is a guitar which is wired and amped that is literally being drugged down the same street, the same country road that James Byrd was drugged. And you see how that guitar begins to moan and screech. You hear it, you see it, and it becomes the stand-in for that body. But you're seeing the pastoral landscape in which that atrocity occurred. It is visceral, as you can imagine, because you cannot not unimagine the body, because the guitar is always seen as this extension of the body, right? I mean, when you see people playing the guitar, often they're mouthing the sounds of the guitar itself, and it's always seen as an extension of the body. In this case, it is the stand-in for that body.
You know, then I was talking with one of our other curators some time ago about the guitar, and he mentioned the shape of a guitar, sort of reminiscent of the shape of a body.
Yes.
You know, and I can see that image of a guitar being dragged down and imagine a body, a tender flesh and blood and bone body on this very rough pavement. Mm. So we've talked about the song, we've talked about how it sort of impacts visual art. I'm interested in your ideas and your opinion on how do we think art is going to take today's moment and reflect on 1930 and Strange Fruit and continue to move forward creating messages in art and love and power so that we can continue learning this story from days long by.
Well, I mean, how many artists go back to meditate on Strange Fruit? That I can't say. What I will say that artists are speaking to the moment now. And you don't have to look far, but in the press photographs of what's happening actually at the Robert E. Lee Monument, the fact that there are markings there. Some people would say graffiti. Some people say, I think these are all, there's language there, but there are also marks there. There are dancing that takes place on that monument. There are projections that are placed on that monument. There are people speaking poetry at that monument. There's a woman playing the cello at the monument. So it becomes a site. It becomes a site which is both a site of protest, but it's also a site of healing. You know, that people come right here to this building, right outside of our building, to see rumors of war. And that becomes a site in which people meditate. It becomes a moment it becomes a moment to reflect. It becomes a moment to honor. You know, when that monument first came, it was very, Kehinde was very clear about from where it came from, that it really was about that composite individual, that stand-in individual for all of those who had died, who had been murdered, you know. And I like to think that the meaning of who is being memorialized, the idea of who is being memorialized has now expanded to encompass all of the youth that are now out on the front lines. It is an homage. I believe it is now, in a very prescient way, an homage to the people who are now out on that street. So we've yet to see what's going to come out of this moment. We've yet to see it. I think there are things that are happening. You know, there's a lot taking place. A lot of it is of the moment, and it is happening in real time.
It's happening now. I think once upon a time, in a moment like this, there would be concerts everywhere. There would be telethons everywhere. There would be spectacle to say something or to celebrate the progress, hopefully, that's being made. It's powerful to think that in today's world, stricken by this global pandemic, so when years later, when we're watching this video, we can remember what we were doing during COVID.
Yes.
But I think there would be, without the ability to come together for events like that, I'm excited to see what visual artists are doing. I mean, there's been no lack of gatherings in protest. I know of some artists in town who are friends of mine, some who work in this very institution, who have been creating in response or taking their talents to create protest signs and make them available to those around us. There's someone in this very room who takes their ability to spend some time creating packages for this movement to continue going forward. He's off camera.
But we won't say who it is. We'll just look at him and whistle. Yeah.
But it's impactful to me to see how well this community in particular comes together with constructivity. I think about, you're talking about the youth, you're talking about dancers, those two young girls who, in their black tutus and their black point shoes, stand on that monument and pose. And I learned a little bit more about their story. They're not even high school, these girls. They're not high school students yet. They're so young. Just showed up to dance, and there happened to be a photographer who captured their images, those powerful images of these young women who exude power of somebody well beyond their years.
And I have to give a shout out to, I mean, and it is the dance, it is the things that we would anticipate and call, you know, art, but then it's also, like I was saying earlier, this sort of mark making, but let's not forget the graphic designers that are coming up with these amazing posters. Studio, what is it, 2-3, who are creating these sort of markers that are now everywhere.
Is that who's been
Art
doing
180, who's been engaged in, you know, Oakwood Arts. All of them are enabling, are providing the tools for people to come together to create, you know, the sort of graphics that are coming out. So, I mean, that's pretty remarkable. But I did want to give a shout out to Clifford Chambliss, the third, who actually created that amazing sign, Rumors of War Wasn't a Rumor.
Yes.
Well, we were able to acquire that for our archives. So that sign is now in our archives. So I was just so taken that this young man would really understand the premise of Rumors of War. I mean, and really kind of echo that in this most amazing way. So I'm thrilled. I'm thrilled that he was, you know, happy to allow this amazing piece of history to exist in our archives.
And kudos to you for collecting that, for capturing it, for archiving it so that it can be seen. I think there's something also very beautiful about the subject, about the time in which we live and about where we are. For those of you around the world, hopefully checking in or checking in the future, we're in Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy once upon a time.
The former. Yes, thank you for
Once upon
the
a
former
time.
capital of the Confederacy. Let me drink to that.
Go, yes,
Okay.
oh, here we go.
Okay.
I'll drink to that. And here we are, telling our story and the stories of so many other, beyond the lives of people with skin like mine and skin like yours. Beyond even those with dark skin. I mean, trauma and struggle happen to everybody, you know. This conversation happens to be about a very specific type of incident, but it happens to us all. And artists like Billie Holiday continue and will continue to capture those emotions to hopefully express those things for us. I mean, as an artist myself, that's what I'm hoping to do. You know, you channel who you are and what you are, and you give it out. My mother always tells me to do the best you can with what you've got. And that's all I can do.
Absolutely, and people would take it, and I also want to just say that it was just less than, what are we in July? It was less than 8 months ago that we were celebrating 1619.
Right here.
400 years of black bodies existing in the Commonwealth of Virginia. So, I mean, I think all of this has to be placed in a context. We're not even talking about Native American bodies. We're not even talking about indigenous folks. And I mean,
Those conversations too
those
come.
conversations too need to be had. That's things like COVID, although they are impacting the black community, they are decimating the Native American community. And we need to be mindful that oftentimes when we talk about things in this binary of black and white. And the reality is there are so many, what the South looks like today, the complexion of the South is remarkable. I mean, you've got Latin American, well, they were in, I'm from Texas. They had Texas before it was called Texas. It was Tejas, okay? But when you think about, you know, the transplanting of cultures from all over the world that now populate the South, it is transformed. That's why, I mean, I love the idea of the dirty South, because it's not just one or two ingredients. There's a lot of stuff up in there, you know. But getting back to the point you were making about doing what you can with what you have, that idea of refashioning things, envisioning things. When you talk about, I still like to call it folk art, but we'll call it material culture, we'll call it contemporary art, because these artists, although they did not have academic training, they were creating extraordinary works of art, whether they were quilts, whether they were, assemblage works. So in going back to pitch this idea about the dirty South, I mean, I think that's why that triangulation exists, because you do what you can with the expression that you have. And even though artists may not have been academically trained, those works are just as powerful, just as visceral, and just as legible in terms of people's ability to read them and understand them as those works by academically trained artists.
You know, Dirty South, an exhibition coming up in 2021 from Valerie, looks at art from the black community over the span of 100 years, beginning in 1920, the 1920s to now, you know, and the birth of jazz happens around then, and so we have this surgence of very talented and skilled musicians from the darker shade who have no ownership of their music. You know, Billie Holiday sings Strange Fruit in 1939 when the term race records was still a thing being used to describe music coming from people with dark skin, from black people, still owned by white men, you know, owning their music and owning their art. Billie Holiday is known for this song, but she was still a race record singer, you know, way back when. We've progressed quite a bit since then. R&B becomes the new term, and we're going to get to that later on in the series. Have some thoughts about that as well. We're going to get to in a couple of weeks' time. But the visual artist in the 1920s and the 1930s captured these scenes as well. And can you talk a little bit about some of those powerful images?
Well, I mean, I'm thinking of artists that really are reframing something like La Pieta,
Yes.
you know, as a black man being taken from a tree in the same way that Christ was taken down from the cross. So, I mean, you do have that sort of image that becomes repetitive in many ways. I mentioned people like Jacob Lawrence, people like Hale Woodruff, people like Aaron Douglas, which really recounts not only the black contributions, but also the struggles and the strifes. You know, James Weldon Johnson, you know, Lift Every Voice and Sing, really just sort of like chronicles that, both musically, both lyrically, but it also it allows artists to imagine visually what these things look like. It's just like Meeropol was so specific in his language. As you said, lynching is never mentioned, and yet we envision the smell. He even gives us the space to smell. It gives every sensory, the sight, the smell, you know, the feeling of the wind, you know. So he's evoking all of our senses with his writing, which is quite extraordinary. So yes, you have a lot of artists who are really speaking to that throughout the years. I mean, I can go on and on. I think Charles White, when you think about it, who at the time was married to Elizabeth Catlett.
Is that right?
Yes, yes. And so it's at that time then they joined forces with Mexican artists like Diego Rivera, and they began to combine their efforts in terms of large murals. And of course, Elizabeth Catlett leaves and marries Francisco Mora, and so she becomes Elizabeth Catlett Mora. But you do have that long trajectory of artists who are then using their visual acumen, right, for activism, because they are themselves citizens of the world. And as you say, you use the talent, you use the expression that you have to affect change, if only by allowing people to see, you know, and understand the world from a different lens and perspective.
There's something beautiful also about the blending of these artists at that time. You know, Meeropol met the men who became his sons, at W.E.B.'s house, at a party with W.E.B., and these two boys were there. They were introduced, and 2 weeks later, he had sons.
It's
you know,
amazing.
they were working together. They were talking. They were collaborating. This work of activism is certainly not new to us now. We know that. It wasn't new to them at that time. Later on, we'll get the chance to discuss protest music wholly for an episode, and we'll be looking back to the American Revolution to show how it wasn't even new to them. It wasn't something that came out of jazz even. Very art expression has historical evidence that it makes actual cultural impact, lasting impact. Long after my bones and my body become dust, this program will survive and hopefully carry a message into the future as it does, inspiring more art and more conversation, I hope.
Absolutely, absolutely. I absolutely right. And you know, last year we haven't shown it yet. Well, we showed the work by Cheryl Pope, which had the ladder with the boxer bandages around them, which was the number of homicides that had taken place in Chicago in the year that piece was made. There is a beautiful work that we acquired by Ebony Patterson, which was based on the Claude McKay poem, If We Must Die. You know, and that really is about, you know, really, again, I always come back to kind of putting your body on the line, you know, because if you are going to die, rather die standing for something. Mm-hmm. And so that is an amazing, and that poem was written in response to that. There's a beautiful work by an artist named Terry Atkins, which is called Muffled Drums. And of course, it is created to really recount that time in Duluth, Minnesota, when W.E.B. Du Bois went to really protest lynching was an anti-lynching march that took place in 1921. And this piece, Muffled Drums, is just a series of bass drums that are stacked one upon another that reach maybe about 14 feet. Wow. They're really quite a stunning thing, and they're encrusted with these white buttons on the skins, so it really does shimmer, you know. It's quite an extraordinary work of art.
I'm able to look that up. That gives me chills thinking about it. Girl, I have to sing in a minute. You got to give me a little.
It's all fodder for that emotion coming out, so I'm just putting it out there.
Absolutely. Valerie, I could speak to you the rest of my life.
Wait a minute, our time is over?
I think they're giving me
the wrap it up
signal.
Moment?
We'll take a couple more minutes.
Why not? Okay, all right.
We'll take a little bit more
This
time.
went too fast.
It did. I'm thinking it's giving me pause about future episodes only being 30 minutes. I have so much to say.
Well, yes.
And we're definitely going to have you come back to be with us. Before we move on to an actual performance of the song Strange Fruit, Valerie, what lasting impressions, what lasting message would you like to leave with our audience, not only about Strange Fruit, but about the important work of your programming, of the story behind the Dirty South that is to come, that you'd like to leave with our people?
Well, I think we're really seeing great transformation. We are living in a time of great transformation. What I love about contemporary art is that we're writing history as it happens. So I'm really excited about writing this history right now.
I'm really excited that I have my position here and that I get to stand next to you as you write it and hopefully add a few words in myself.
Well, I'm thankful for you.
Oh, thank you for bringing me. I mean, I learned from you, really, every conversation. I don't just flatter. I greatly admire you, and I greatly admire the work you've done. And please, if you haven't been to VMFA yet, check out every inch of art you can see, especially focusing on walking up to the campus and seeing rumors of war looking down at you, celebrating something new and something positive and something uplifting, but still telling a very painful story. Walk inside, visit every gallery, and understand, please, that it is our mission to show you that your story, too, is told within our walls. And Valerie, more and more, I'm seeing my story told in my place of work, and I thank you for that.
Well, thank you. I have one tiny postscript, which I'd love to put is, you know, we lost William Royal, Bill Royal.
Yes.
And I just wanted to take a moment to honor him and to let audiences know and our patrons know what an impact he and his wife have made on this institution, starting with spearheading the acquisition for Rumors of War. And when people walk in, they will also see an amazing sculpture called Black Steel in the Hour of Chaos, which is on loan from them, which is gracing the atrium. And then we have actually created the galleries to be a memoriam to Bill.
I saw that message today. But I thought it was beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, and thank you for honoring Bill Royal. Has been very impactful for this museum, and I got to meet him years ago when I first came on board, up there in the Muse, where our cocktails come from. Well, folks, I lament that our discussion has to come to an end, but if you'll stick with us, give us just a handful of moments as we adjust our lens. We have a presentation to wrap up our story. southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root. Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from poplar trees. Pastoral scene of the gallant South, big bulging eyes and a twisted mouth, scent of magnolia, sweet and fresh, then the sudden smell of burning flesh. Here is a fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rot, for the trees to drop. Here is a strange and bitter crop. Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves, dripping blood at the root. Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze. Strange fruit hanging from poplar trees. Pastoral scene of the gallant South, big bulging eyes, twisted mouth, scent of magnolia, clean, sweet, fresh. Then the sudden smell, burning flesh. Here is a fruit for the crows to pluck, for rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rot, for is a strange and bitter crop. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for loving with us. From the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in Richmond, Virginia, this has been the Dominion Energy Jazz Cafe. I'm Robert Phanord, and I'll see you next time.